world-renowned as a research institution specializing in engineering and the physical sciences. It may therefore come as somewhat of a surprise that on the east side of campus, in the Department of Linguistics and Philosophy, a committed group of theoretical linguists has begun the study of Zazaca. The department, founded in 1961 by Morris Halley and Noam Chomsky, has set the pace for much of the intellectual work that has subsequently made linguistics a strong and lively branch of the cognitive sciences. Today, with over 40 PhD students in the graduate program, the department maintains its focus on the continued importance of approaches to the discovery of both mental and cultural universals and contrasts. Part of the graduate training includes topics in the grammar of a less familiar language, a course initiated by Professor Kenneth Hale. On February 6, 2003, 9 MIT graduate students, led by Professors Michael Kenstowitz, a phonologist, and Norvin Richards, a syntactician, began their study of the relatively underdocumented Zazaki language. Zazaki can be classified as an endangered language as it is being spoken less and less by younger generations. Since the beginning of the 20th century, Zazaki has been accepted as a language of its own among linguists and not any longer merely as a Kurdi or Kurdish dialect. Nevertheless, until recently, the Zaza people were generally held to be Kurds, speaking a special dialect of Kurdi. Due to the oppressive minority and language policy of the Republic of Turkey, until 15 years ago there existed practically no indigenous Zazaki written literature, and so no means by which the Zaza people could find out anything about their own language and cultural identity. We interviewed Noam Chomsky on globalization and its effects on endangered languages.
Well, it's a complicated issue. First of all, when we talk about endangered languages, people usually have in mind third world languages or fourth world languages. They don't have in mind the languages of, say, Europe. But the languages of Europe are severely endangered. In fact, they've been disappearing at a very rapid rate. It's an early stage of what's now called globalization. I mean, with the formation of national states in Europe and the integration of the European societies, right within the most advanced region of Western civilization, there's been very rapid decline of languages. So plenty of people can't talk to their grandmothers now because the languages have just disappeared. In fact, one of the major research programs in linguistics today is a European Union program studying disappearing languages in Europe. They're called dialects, but they're just different languages. And on the other hand, and this bears on globalization, the integration of Europe and the kind of move towards centralization and so on has set up a counter-reaction. So an increasing regionalization, and a lot of the regional languages are being revived with a good deal of commitment and intensity. And it's, so in Spain, for example, Catalan is much more lively than, under Franco it was suppressed. You walked in the streets of Barcelona, you never heard it. But now it's the language of Catalonia, The Basque language has been revived considerably. Other so-called dialects like Asturian and others are also becoming, people always spoke them, but now they're speaking them self-consciously and interested in reviving them in the culture and so on. And it's happening elsewhere too. You walk in the streets of Wales and school children are speaking Welsh. There is a reaction to the centralization and integration which is leading to revival of regional identities, local cultures, practices, folk songs, language, and so on. And I suspect we're seeing it's harder worldwide. This is a rich, privileged area, so lots of things can happen that aren't going to happen in the American Southwest or, Aboriginal Australia. But still, I think something similar can be found. So the general process is one of leveling and destruction. On the other hand, the human beings are complicated creatures. They also struggle for their own rights, so you get counter reactions.
Beyond the political importance of studying Zazaki, theoretical linguists can benefit from the study of an underdocumented language.
We are trying to put together a puzzle that has been scattered across all the languages of the world, that every language that we look at has something to contribute to our theoretical understanding of how human languages are put together. So I've been working with you on how questions are put together in Zazaki, and that's helped me to understand better how questions are put together more generally. There are things I understand better, for example, about a language from the Philippines that I work with, Tagalog, because of the things that you've taught me about how Zazaki works. So there are those kinds of connections. It's also important, I think, for the community who speak Zazaki themselves to understand that the language is a valuable and an important language, that it's got properties that are of great importance and interest to theoretical linguists.
The nature of the course then is to allow our students to put into practice some of the theory that they've learned in describing a language that's unfamiliar to them. And Zazaki is particularly interesting then, and it's an Indo-European language. As you know, many Indo-European languages have been very well studied, but there are some that have not, and your language is one of them.
The class was conducted once a week for 14 weeks, supplemented by additional individual meetings between each student and Gülcem Aktaş, the class's Zazaki consultant.
Interesting effects with vowel changes that we talked about a lot in the class so far.
We found that there are at least two different types of this construction, which is kind of surprising because it would expect and they show some kind of behavior which is also unexpected at first sight. So I'm trying to see exactly how these groups pattern together and try to give an account for
Each graduate student spent the course of the semester writing a research paper on a particular topic in Zazaki grammar.
So I'm working on how Zazaki speakers mark the source of information they have for the claims that they make in their sentences. And I found it interesting because it's done in a very different way.
I'm interested in finding out what happens to words and other linguistic things when they're taken into Zazaki and made Zazaki. How do they change, and how do Zazaki speakers change them?
But I've been looking at our causatives, the way you say that somebody made someone do something, and I like that. I think that's really interesting.
Quite a few interesting phenomena which we are only beginning to understand. Things like, I'm sure people have already talked about evidentials, also the as-if construction. In linguistics, be it formal linguistics or any other kind, we're still really just beginning to get a grasp of how those kinds of structures work. And Zaza is a great language for exploring that. It's really important.
One of my main interests is in a lot of different languages is the way that questions are formed. Zazaki has a way of forming questions that allows you to either do nothing, leave a question word in situ, which is something we find in a bunch of different languages, or to move it to the front of the sentence by a variety of means. So you can ask questions like, so you can take a statement like "Es que tal dato," and you can change that to a question like "To que tal da kanjichineke," or you can make that into a question by taking kanjichineke and moving it to the front. So like "Kanjichineka ku to que tal da." That sort of optionality in that way of having a choice between two different ways of forming questions, that in itself is interesting. And the conditions on when you can use which of those types of questions, that's interesting as well. So there are a lot of very sort of complicated facts about the way questions are formed that are useful toward our understanding of human language more generally.
I didn't know that much about Kurdish society. I'd known about the Kurdish diaspora and so forth, and the fragmentation of the Kurdish nation across a bunch of national boundaries, but that was about it. I had never met, until I met you, until I met our interviewer, I had never met a Kurdish person ever.
After we started our work in the linguistics department on Zazaki, we decided to see how it might benefit other people in the MIT community and what the sort of general level of understanding and knowledge was about Zazaki and Kurdish language quite generally. So we decided to spend the afternoon polling random MIT students about what they know, and here's what we found.
I study mechanical engineering and electrical engineering.
Okay, we have an engineer here. Do you know what Zazaki is?
Zazaki. Not without any context.
No, okay.
No.
Any guesses or?
No, not off the top of my head.
Okay, what if I told you, which is actually true, that Zazaki is a language? Where do you think it might be spoken?
It's tough. I would guess possibly Central or South America, or possibly Africa, maybe, somewhere in the Pacific Islands, but I don't know.
I wanted to ask you if you knew what Zazaki is.
Sorry, no.
Now, Zazaki is a language. Where do you think it's spoken?
Africa?
Africa. It turns out to be spoken by Kurds. So what language would that make it most closely related to?
I have no idea.
Have you ever heard of a language called Zazaki?
No, I haven't.
Okay. Does it ring any bells? Do you have any guess where it might be spoken?
I assume I know most European languages, so I'm guessing it's not one of those. It might be one of the former Soviet ones. Might be an Asian, African, it might be a Native American. I don't know. I have no guesses really.
Okay. It turns out Zazaki is spoken by Kurdish people.
Okay.
Now, do you have any guesses what languages Kurdish might be related to?
Arabic, or if there's a Turkish dialect, or Hindi possibly.
Zazaki? No, I don't know.
Just venture any guess. Zazaki.
It sounds foreign. I mean,
Yes.
it doesn't sound Western.
Yes, well, what if I told you, and in fact it is, Zazaki is a language. Zazaki is a language. Where is it spoken?
Must be in some Middle Eastern tribe.
Middle East. Very good, very close.
Sounds Indian.
It sounds Japanese. I have no idea.
Sounds Indian to you, Japanese to you. What, now, if I told you that Zazaki was a language, where would you think it's spoken?
Zazaki is a West Iranian language spoken in southeast Anatolia, northwest to the Kurdi or Kurdish-speaking regions. Estimates of the number of speakers vary from 1 to 2.5 million people. The major cities where Zazaki is spoken include Diyarbakir, Darsim, Mush, Elaziz, and Bingöl on the upper courses of the Euphrates, Kızılırmak, and Murat rivers. In considering Zazaki, we may raise the question, what is the difference between a language and a dialect?
That's a very difficult question. Sort of in layman's terms, it would be that two varieties of the same language that are more or less mutually intelligible to one another. Structurally, it's very difficult to give a definition.
One thing that linguists often say about dialects versus languages, which you asked about earlier, is that a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. And that just goes to show that, again, it's more a matter of how people think of languages and what kind of social uses they have that determines whether we call it a language versus a dialect.
A lot of linguists think that there actually are no such things as either languages or dialects. We have this tendency to define things as languages or dialects based on political criteria. So we call things dialects if they are close together and both within a single country, and we call them languages if they are in different countries. Those aren't the kinds of criteria that linguists are interested in, so there are no linguistic criteria that allow you to say these two things are dialects or these two things are languages. So for example, we customarily talk about the ways people speak in China, the Cantonese and Mandarin, for example. We talk about those and we call them dialects because they are both spoken in China, but they're no more similar to each other than Spanish and French. I mean, they're related, but they're not mutually intelligible. There's no real reason to call them dialects instead of languages. We call Norwegian and Swedish different languages because they're spoken in different countries, but they are mutually intelligible. Someone who only speaks Norwegian, someone who only speaks Swedish or Danish, they can understand each other. So it's not clear that there is a good definition of language or dialect. So this is a dictionary of Kırmancki. You were asking me earlier about differences between Kırmancki and Zazaki. It's very clear looking at the end that there are a number of them. So, you know, my book in this language apparently is Pertukamin. In your language, I guess it would be Kataben. I guess what all this means is that if someone tries to belittle a way of speaking by saying, well, that's just a dialect, it's not a real language, that for a linguist that kind of claim has no meaning.
Bearing that in mind, can we identify and describe differences between what we call Zazaki and English?
In English, we mark the source of information for our claims by using parentheticals or adverbs. So if we want to claim that Bill's a doctor, but we want to convey the fact that we don't have intimate personal knowledge of that fact, we say things like, Bill's a doctor, they say, or apparently Bill is a doctor. In Zazaki, this kind of information is conveyed by the choice of the form of the verb that you use in the sentence. So when you want to convey that your source of information is indirect, that you don't know about it personally, you didn't see it, you use the perfect form of the verb instead of the unmarked past form.
Zazaki has some sounds that English doesn't have, and vice versa. There are sounds in English that don't appear in Zazaki. And of course there are other differences in the syntax. For example, Zazaki has case endings and we don't in English.
So it doesn't have articles. It has the verb following both the subject and object. What is curious to me is that sometimes you can have things after the verb, but not always, and I still haven't figured out when you can have it and when you can't.
The tense of the sentence has an effect on the forms of the nouns, which is unusual. It's not something you find in English and lots of other languages. So I would say mkatavdato is katavdana to, I guess, right? So you change that from to is. The subject of the sentence changes its case depending on the tense of the sentence.
In what way has the discovery of these phenomena enriched your ability to do field work with a native speaker?
So this book is about how to do field work, not only in foreign countries, but working with native speakers of languages that we don't know, like we've been doing with Gülcem. Often linguists just work from books and grammars, or they work on languages that they know or someone they know knows, languages that are easily accessible. So we had to learn how to do things a little bit differently to work with languages that aren't already described.
Yes, I think that a number of the students are interested in carrying forward their research. One semester is very difficult to get anything conclusive done. We're just getting familiar with the nature of the language and what some interesting problems are, but we need more time to investigate them further.
One of the frustrating things about this course is that we spend a semester working on a language which is just about enough time to see how interesting it is, and then the course stops. And so I definitely want to continue to explore some of the things that I've learned in the course of this class.
The field is in a very lively state. There's, for one thing, rather sophisticated work is underway on a very wide variety of typologically different languages, far more so than, say, 20 or 30 years ago. And that in itself is an exciting development, because it's just like biologists being able to study all sorts of new species. Of course, you can learn all sorts of things, challenges, preconceptions, leads to new ideas, and so on. There's quite exciting new work going on in domains that were not very intensively studied until recently, like certain areas of semantics and for example, which is fairly recent development. My own particular interests happen to be in attempts to try to determine to what extent the human language faculty is actually perfectly designed, well designed to meet certain specific conditions that a human language must meet. And I think there's been exciting work in that area, which raises some interesting questions and challenges to biology generally. So by and large, it's an exciting period. Especially the last 20 or 30 years have been pretty remarkable.
What can a population do to maintain their language despite the presence of a more dominant language?
There's no simple answer to that. You just have to do it. And it has been done. Places like some of those I mentioned, like, for example, in Catalonia, under the Franco dictatorship, the language really was suppressed. In the Kurdish areas, people have maintained Kurdish under tremendous repression. A lot of young people may not not know it because they haven't allowed to study it, and you only talk it. It's the language your parents talk at home, maybe, but not yours, and that has to be revived. And there's really there's no answer to that. It's what people are willing to do.
Since we find that the best linguistic work very often gets done by people who speak the language themselves, because they know they can always ask themselves, well, how would I say it, or does this sound right, or does this sound wrong, and so forth. So, in addition to what we've already done, this kind of fieldwork, I think we're very interested in having Zaza people themselves become linguists and do linguistic